I'm sure a few of you may have some questions for Graham in the Q&A session, so we'll get through our final presentation and then into that Q&A session for you. So this is a case study on up to 60% wind and solar for a new mining venture. Justin Brown is the Executive Director of Element 25. Justin is a geologist with over 20 years experience in minerals exploration and development. It's a strong technical background with experience in the full spectrum of mineral exploration and mining, from grassroots target generation through to resource development and mine production. Justin was the founding managing director of Element 25 and has held a number of board positions in both executive and non-executive capacities. Please welcome Justin.
Thank you, Zach, and thanks for the opportunity to introduce our project here today. Element 25 is it's fair to say, the minnow of this group. We're a pre-production story which has, or is in the process of taking a project from discovery through to production. And the space we're going to be operating in is in the high purity manganese business, which is a little bit new to most of you, I suspect. Small company still, 60 million market cap, well funded with about 8 million in the bank, funding our pre-feasibility, definitive feasibility studies on the Butcherbird Manganese project. What are we trying to do? We're trying to make a sort of a metal product out of an ore. We're taking our material through the full spectrum of processing, right from mining through to electrolytic of metals. The high purity manganese market is not the typical manganese market that most of you will be familiar with in the context of the Woody mine or the Burton Creek mine. We're not shipping concentrate, we're shipping a high purity product. And the three products that fit into the high purity manganese space are electrolytic manganese metal, high purity manganese sulfate for NMC batteries, and electrolytic manganese dioxide. There's a bit of detail on those products for those who want to download the presentation from the website and learn a little bit more about it. But they're all quite different in terms of their marketability, if you like. The two that we're going to focus on are electrolytic manganese metal, which goes into traditional steel markets, but also the high purity manganese sulfate product, which goes into the new age or new energy applications for EVs, etc., in the form of NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt batteries. All expected to enjoy strong growth, so it's a good time to bring a project into production to carve out a part of the market share for our company. And one of the interesting things from a macro perspective is that this industry has been dominated by China for the last 20 or 30 years. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we believe that is coming to a close, and costs in China, in fact, going up and becoming less competitive. We've got some very interesting attributes to our project that mean we can we think comfortably compete on a cost basis with China on the production of these products. So we're trying to take, I guess, a downstream processing mentality to an Australian project, which is not always the way we do it here, and probably should. As I said, there's a bunch of reasons why China's struggling. Their labour costs, power costs are going up, access to cheap local ores are diminishing, and so we think we're well positioned to compete. The project that underpins this sort of ambition is what we call the world-class Butcherbird Manganese project. It's Australia's largest onshore manganese resource. It is huge, currently north of 260 million tonnes in JORC resource. About 50 plus million tonnes of that is measured and indicated. We could drill that out further if we wanted to. It's a huge resource, located about 500 kilometres south of Port Hedland, about 100 kilometres south of the town of Newman. Situated straddling the Great Northern Highway and the Goldfields gas pipeline, so we've got some really nice infrastructure benefits there from a logistics and power point of view. And we've got a new innovative process which allows us to process this material into a high purity form for export to industrial users in probably Asia and Europe primarily. A bird's eye view of the project, you can see the coloured blocks of the resource area. The orange and green are the measured indicated areas that we're going to focus on for the initial 25 years of mine life. But within that mining lease application, there's about 100 million tonnes of ore, which is probably sufficient mine inventory to take us out 100 years of mine life. So this thing is going to be there for decades once it gets up and running. The solid red line is the Goldfields, the Great Northern Highway, which takes us either north to Port Hedland or south to Fremantle for export. And the gas pipeline in the dotted line goes straight through the middle of the resource. So we've got access to cheap traditional energy. Geologically, this ore body is incredibly simple. It's a free dig ore body. It sits at surface. There's no strip. It sits above the water table, so there's no dewatering. So we don't have a lot of the challenges that mining traditionally experiences in Western Australia or elsewhere. It's phenomenally simple and low cost. It's probably going to be about 4% of our overall operating costs. So whilst technically it's a mine, it's kind of much more a processing plant and a power station. And this is kind of the breakthrough, I guess, that we enjoyed in 2017 to open the door well and truly for us to take this from a concentrated shipping business to a leach, purify and electrowin business to make manganese metal or the other products that I talked about earlier. These are much higher value products. So traditionally a manganese ore producer might ship product out at a couple $100 US a tonne. These high purity products ship out at an order of magnitude higher than that in the $2,000 to $3,000 a tonne range. So we go from being a high volume, low margin business to a low volume, high margin business, which makes us much more resilient over the longer term and makes a lot more commercial sense in our view. We developed a very simple leach extraction flow sheet, which is much simpler than traditional producers of these high purity manganese products, and therefore much lower cost. It's an atmospheric pressure ambient temperature leach. We don't need to do any of the calcination steps that a lot of our competitors will need to do. And if we're looking to make manganese metal, we need a power solution, and we've done a lot of work on why renewables should be a part of that solution, and I'll move into that sort of space now. You need a lot of power if you want to make metal, so just to put it in a bit of context, if you want to make copper, it's about 3 megawatt hours per tonne, manganese is about 6 megawatt hours per tonne, and aluminium is probably double that. So these things are power hungry. It's the single biggest operating cost for us, and you need to get it right. If you can't get a power solution that's cost effective, you can't make an electrowinning business work. Basically the process is pretty simple. You take an anode cathode of a certain composition, you run a current through it with your leach solution in the bath that contains the metal that you want to plate. And if you do it right, the metal plates out on the cathode, and you then strip that and ship it as your product. But you've got to get the power right. We have done about 12 months worth of work now on this. We started a discovery study that basically looked at gas only. We knew we had the Goldfields gas pipeline available to us, and as others have referred to, relatively cost competitive gas prices in Western Australia. And that blue line is an estimate of where we think gas power generation would put us. The overlying graph is basically some data from the International Renewable Energy Agency that shows the trends that I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with of declining costs for onshore wind and solar, and that obviously made it something we need to look at. We need to reduce our costs from power, but also we want the ancillary benefits of reducing the carbon intensity of our products, and market research that we've done shows that the end users of these products do want it decarbonised, and we see that trend only growing as time passes. So we've got effectively all three, I guess, obvious power sources available: gas, wind and solar. The work that we've done in conjunction with Avisian on modelling the optimal ratios probably puts us at about 50-50 wind and solar with 50% gas, and a cost of power which is cheaper than gas only. So that'll obviously be finalised as part of our pre-feasibility study going forward, but it really puts us on the map in terms of getting our power costs down to compete with our competitors, who are primarily China, and that's kind of just puts a bit of perspective around that. Our base case sat us at around 9 cents US per kilowatt hour. We're doing work now that we think will drive that significantly down, much closer to the cost of power that our Chinese competitors pay for their energy. And because of our innovative leach and processing methodology, we are dramatically more cost effective on the front end. If we can compete with China on the back end, we can genuinely take our ore all the way through the metal at the lowest cost globally. Beyond that, we've been looking at engineering solutions to push past that 50-50 that I talked about is really just still a traditional engineering approach where you basically use your wind and solar and you fill in the valleys with your gas. to provide a steady state power supply. That's kind of how engineers have looked at these processing plants in the past, and if you look at electrowinning plants that do this work in China, that's exactly what they do. So they have a fixed set of conditions, and they want a steady supply of power to power those electrowinning cell houses. Arena's chipped in about $500 million grant to co-fund some research work that we're doing with Murdoch University on how we can pull the levers in an electrowinning cell house to allow more dynamic energy consumption. To give you an idea, there's all sorts of variables you can move. You can move voltage, current density, leach concentrations, cathode dimensions and composition, etc. So we think there's work that we can do to show that you can actually improve on the engineering of how we electrowinning metals to allow higher penetration of renewables. And obviously, as we push that penetration up, we reduce our costs and the carbon intensity of our product. And we think that's the right strategy for us going forward. That work will play out over the next 12 months. So I guess a lot of people talked about exporting hydrogen, renewable energy in the form of hydrogen. When we sort of talk internally about, why wouldn't you do it with metals? And we can take renewable energy, embed it in metal, and ship it to export markets in the same way you can do that with hydrogen. Logistically, it's a lot easier to transport metals. There is hydrogen, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that Australia's got, not just manganese, but also copper, lead, zinc, that can follow this path. And so we think the advent of cheap renewable energy really provides an opportunity in industry to take a lot of the ores that we traditionally ship out as a concentrate or even just straight direct ship ore, and use some of these new technologies to take those through to metal form using electrolysis or other methods. We think it's a real opportunity for the industry, and we're hoping to be leaders in that space. So it gets along with, at least the electronic space, I think will probably be the main leaders. Obviously, some of the other groups in this room are looking at other ways of applying renewable energy, but that's one that we think has got a lot of potential. As an alternative or adjunct to hydrogen export, why not export metal with renewable energy embedded in it? So just back to the corporate sort of path that we're following, I guess. We're in a pre-feasibility study stage. That's due for publication in July, August of this year. We believe that will show a very robust economic case for this project. Obviously, there's a journey beyond that to DFS, project financing, build, and then production, but also because we've got such a massive resource, we can then grow this project quite aggressively to capture market share over a period measured in decades, not years. That time frame that we can talk about, because the resource size places us ideally into the renewable space, we can do long-term contracts with potential independent power providers, and that's the kind of strategy we're taking. We could look at a 25-year mine life, we could look at a 50-year mine life, and obviously the longer you can contract out, the cheaper you can get the power. And for the reasons I talked about, power is critical to what we're trying to do. So obviously getting support from a lot of industry players on various aspects of the project: metallurgy, environmental, engineering, importantly power. Resilient's been following us on, or walking along with us on that journey. Arena's kicked in some very helpful funding to do some of the R&D work we're doing in conjunction with Murdoch University. And obviously you'll see our own team grow as well as we advance this project towards production. Look, we think this is a really meaningful project. We think that it can produce the cleanest, lowest cost manganese, high purity manganese products globally. And obviously we're in a tier 1 jurisdiction in Western Australia that knows mining, knows processing, and has a growing skill set in the cheap renewable energy space as well. Look, we're going to be here for a while if we get this thing up, and I think you'll see it as part of the landscape in decades to come. Thanks very much.
Justin, if I can get David, Bethwyn and Graham to come back up onto stage and take a seat on the sofas. And I assume we've got our dice mic hanging around, ready to be thrown about. Can we sit anywhere? Right at the front, excellent. I think we're slightly ahead of schedule, which means we get more time for questions, which is excellent because all four of these presentations, I think, have been a fantastic presentation and some really current and interesting projects going on. And a real opportunity for you, in this conference setting, to ask easy or hard questions. So with that in mind, do we have anyone who wants to start us off with a question? One down the front.
Thank you. I have thousands of questions, but there is one curiosity, and there is a question for Graham Owens. It's because Anglo American installed the first floating solar in a pond 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and I watched in your presentation something of Cerro Corona in Peru, that you have a project of 5 megawatts of solar floating. If you could explain something about that, because it's really, it's one in your slides. I saw it.
The Cerro Corona solar power, I'm not sure about that one. I know it's on that slide deck, but I look after Australia. But I wasn't aware we had a 5 megawatt up there. Is that in plan?
Feasibility. Let's look at that.
It's just being looked at the moment. There we go.
Right down the back, see if you can throw that photo.
Oh, can we kind of throw it over to you and then we'll... No?
Daniel Allen, Department of Environment and Energy. The speakers this morning talked about how internal silos can sometimes be an issue with getting these projects up, but clearly we've seen that there's some quite incredible projects that do get up. Would you be happy to talk about navigating these ideas up through internal governance structures?
I suppose from Goldfield's point of view, one thing that we have done is we've driven the ownership of energy projects down to site general managers. So now they have to be driving our energy saving projects as well as some of those other larger projects. So we tend to get a lot more traction when it's driven by the site rather than trying to be pushed down from the top.
Just reiterate that comment. One of the big challenges we have generally with sites and operations is the requirement for the uninterrupted power source, and so the temptation is to constantly go to what they know, which is quick and fast, and it's on-site diesel, especially when you don't have integrated networks, which is what we are trying to develop now. So one of the things that we've tried to do as a business is pull the energy strategy to a corporate level so we can hit carbon emissions and low-cost energy targets. But it's early engagement with owners at the sites and the operations, because if they're not happy and they can't, I guess, get comfortable with the security of supply issues, then it's a real challenge internally to make those projects get support.
The observation I would make is that you do also have to have some corporate leadership in this, and our CEO, John Melbourne, is obviously very passionate about this area, and is about the automation journey that we're going on at Syama. So I think there's a combination of what my two colleagues here referred to as the sites needing to take control and ownership of what is effectively a business opportunity for them, but also it needs support and leadership from the top.
Yeah, Jez, we broke earlier the journey that some of our colleagues here, and we've been mostly on technical and commercial studies really. Government engagement will probably come later, so ask me next year.
Go on.
Maybe I'll ask one, Ross, the mic is moving across. To Graham and David, so with solar battery costs still coming down, surely it would make more economic sense to wait a year or two, doesn't it? Why now and why not wait?
I think in our case, it's the fact that the spinning reserve benefit is immediate. So whether the battery is going to be better next year, it means there's a greater gain, sure, but in fact the reduction in the cost of maintaining the spinning reserve is greater than, if you like, future gains that might be made from lower battery prices. I think that's very much the driver for us.
I think you have to start somewhere, and I think a lot of what we're putting in, we're putting wind in, we're putting solar, and the battery is probably the smaller component. And if the technology changes in a few years' time, then we'll probably need to upgrade, but we've got to get started somewhere. As Dave mentioned, the opportunities with spinning reserve is fairly substantial when you're running generators for just in case, and you can even have the battery, that saving will pay for itself fairly quickly.
So my question was almost exactly the same as Neil's, or very similar. It's on the battery cost. I guess we see these numbers from BNEF of, US $200 a kilowatt hour, which is basically for electric cars. But I don't think batteries for the sort of uses you're talking about are anything like as cheap as that. And I just wondered, have you seen over the course of developing these projects, have you seen the cost of the batteries actually come down in the same ways as the graphs show? And if you could maybe just talk a little bit about the battery costs within your projects.
I'm going to defer to Graham because it's a level of detail that I'm probably not acquainted with. And certainly the trends in battery prices is not something which I have expertise. I think we're comfortable that the component of the overall project that it represents is very good value.
Yeah, I'll probably refer back to Dave on this. I think he knows more about it than I do.
Some often in the organisations obviously talked us both into it.
A question in the middle.
David Campbell from L&T Energy. This is probably more directed at Graham, but you others probably have an opinion as well. So life of mine is often quoted as a big barrier to getting some of these high capex projects across the line, and particularly in the gold mining sector as well, where the life of mine can be quite short. How have you guys managed to get these projects across the line? Because I noticed, your contract lengths are quite long. So I'm just wondering how you guys have managed to close that gap.
As far as Granny Smith goes, Granny Smith's mine life more than covers off the length of that agreement. And for the Agnew one, as I mentioned, we've put a lot of money into exploration over the past 17 years we've been in business. And we're starting to see some success for that. The dollars we spent there, particularly with Agnew, and we believe that that's the mine life that we have. We've also committed and just put a new camp in at Agnew as well, so we believe there's a fairly long life in both of those assets.
Can I just make a comment on that as well, which is, I think one of the challenges we have as a power producer is that industry or power providers require the off-taker to match the term of the infrastructure, and that's a very challenging position for us to be in, particularly in renewables and clean technology environment, as technology is constantly changing. We don't want 20-year PPAs because in 5 years the battery price is significantly different. Hydrogen is getting more developed, or there's new funky solar panels or something, and it's constantly changing. So I think that old methodology of requiring the off-taker to fully underwrite renewables projects, I mean, that's just not something that we would probably entertain, and I think there has to be a bit of a, I guess, different approach to some companies within the industry about risk sharing and understanding the region in which you're operating to make informed decisions about whether you can take longer term risk on something while delivering a lower price to your customer, because it's not always, I think, palatable to, particularly I would say for Fortescue, to enter into long-term arrangements without limited flexibility. It really does need to be a partnership where both parties are taking risk, and that really comes with partnering with somebody who understands the region, and so that's probably a challenge that we're seeing.
I think also with one of our partners in particular, with the Greco, that they've been prepared to upgrade as new technology comes along, and we've put some new, more efficient engines in at Granny Smith over the past few years. So there's an ongoing commitment for them to keep up to date with the technology as well, so we won't be left behind.
Thank you. Any other questions out there?
It's Dick again. I've got some thoughts on. I'd like your thoughts on, and maybe Bethrin, you've got a shipping fleet that plays into Scope 3. So it's a two-part question. I mean, the Scope 3 emissions, I think, are becoming a weight keepers for many of the big mining companies. But as part of that is there currency for green commodities, and is that playing into a competitive space?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there absolutely is a market for green commodities, particularly green iron ore in terms of how it's being processed and delivered. That's obviously our core business. But China has a very aggressive emissions trading scheme, and I think it would be lapse of industry to not respond to that in the way it's producing its exports. Scope 3 is very difficult. It's very difficult to control, and I think our focus is primarily on Scope 1 and Scope 2 to start with, but you definitely cannot ignore Scope 3, particularly if you're trading with China. But we are looking at how can we make our iron ore, our products, more green, and that includes some of the comments about that you had around processing and making sure that you're shipping green energy within the mineral that you're exporting.
I think Australia's in a good position for transparency on the supply chain too. So we can obviously track supply all the way through, which I think helps with some of that carbon counting type stuff that's coming, and I think that's a benefit to us.
Dean Toole at Recco. How are y'all, each of your companies, dealing with the green attribute of your projects? So you've all gone down this path of adding renewables in, but in some cases the green component isn't necessarily quantifiable. So how do y'all deal with that internally, at least as a general?
I think all of us increasingly have to report emissions, whatever they may be, and clearly we will record and maintain an inventory of greenhouse emissions and the difference in those emissions that we'll achieve through these projects. We certainly have numbers that indicate that reduction. It might sound a little sort of dismissive of the issue, but the primary focus for us is economic. We actually think that there's a substantial environmental benefit, and in the long run we think that might become the overwhelming driver. For the moment we're actually driven as much as anything by economic value, but we do see that there will be emissions reductions and we can quantify those.
Yeah, fairly much the same. And we often compare back to equivalents of what emissions from diesel versus gas. So that, and we track it regularly. We have to report those on an annual basis about what the CO2 equivalents are that we have. So they're tracked regularly, reported through to the government. We actively try to reduce our emissions with all our business improvement projects over the year.
I think it would be fair to say if we had two projects that were of the same economic value, but one had a lower carbon intensity, that would win. So it's definitely factored in as a value, and it's definitely factored in as, I guess, a risk to business, but we are the same, I guess, as David's point in that it really does have to make economic sense to start with, and then we start to look at what's the carbon emissions and the intensity associated with that, particularly when there's uncertainty with carbon policy in Australia and whether there will be carbon trading schemes. And for Fortescue, it's the risk of the emissions trading schemes that countries like China are introducing. That drives our behaviour from a carbon perspective.
Any other question there? Over there, sure. Yeah. Sit down a minute.
Hi. Jim Lang with FMG, with an interest in biogas. biogas lends itself to good productivity in places like West Africa, where you've got heat and lots of rain or good rainfall, good water-based environment. I was just wondering whether in either Ghana or Mali there was ever any consideration made to incorporating power from biogas using an energy crop to generate power and include that in the mix?
To my knowledge, it's not something we've pursued to date, but I understand the merit of your question. Clearly, there's a real seasonal agricultural environment because of the wet and dry season. And it's interesting, just pondering on your question, because it would generate also some community benefits, I'm sure, in the region. So I think it's something that we could certainly ponder for future development of the group.
Yeah, I think we're fairly much the same. It's something we haven't considered to date. Only fairly recently have we managed to get our own reliable gas generation on site. So haven't gone down that path, but certainly something we would consider having a look at down the track.
Thanks.
Thank you. Short throw. Stefan Hansen from UB. A lot of the cost curves that we're seeing on renewables and battery technology, we're always looking at the technology side of it. And certainly a good part of that is true. But the other part that's true is that the cost of capital and the reduction of cost of capital for deploying renewables is a major driver. Bankability is the key word there, and we're seeing that's actually continuing. In the mining industry, we're still seeing fairly high cost of capital around the energy supply side of it, and that is true for the conventional, but also translates still into the renewable part. And we've seen the game changer for renewables is that it's high cost of capital initially, traded against lower cost of operation later. How do you think you want to deal with that change, the change in having to fund up front? Are you willing to trade more complex deal structures for lower cost of capital to take advantage of that?
Before this view, yes, absolutely. So we will take a more complicated transaction to deliver an overall cost benefit and flexibility to our business. I guess we probably see, and I mentioned this previously in response to David's question, but the time of long-term PPAs in our view is gone. We're just not interested, and so that means you have to be creative in the way you pull together a transaction, but it does also mean you need to have the right partner sitting across the table from you, and that means somebody that can value the risk and rewards that sits for both people, and including things like cost of capital. It does become a challenge, but there are transactions to be done, certainly.
I think I agree with the final point that Beth had made about the partner that's you're joined with to ensure that they've got access to capital at a reasonable price and they have sufficient balance sheet strength to see beyond maybe a short-term mine life.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question and we'll wrap it up. Who wants the last question?
Yeah, Ray Chatfield from Alcoa. Question for you, Graham. I see you had an arena recoupable contribution in your presentation. How did that help you with the development of your project or getting it over the line?
It had a fairly significant impact because of the value of the project. Without that funding, probably struggled to get the wind side of it across the line.
So thank you to our four presenters. I wish you well in the projects as they progress through the full implementation. Please join me in thanking our presenters.